Hi, now we will study the last part of the respiratory physiology part. So we will understand how oxygen is carried by blood and the quantitative relationships describing the oxygen concentration. So previously we talked about alveolar oxygen partial pressure and alveolar ventilation rate, the relations. So when oxygen consumption rate of a person at the resting state is about 250 milliliter of oxygen is necessary per minute. And when she suddenly start to exercise, that can be demand 1000 milliliter of oxygen gas per minute. Can she do this without changing ventilation rate? The answer was no. She has to increase her alveolar ventilation rate to keep up with the demand of alveolar partial pressure of oxygen high enough. So now we will consider about oxygen carriage inside the water or blood plasma. As you know, our blood contains almost half of them are RBCs, so that we call as a hematocrit. So when you collect a blood and then centrifuge, what will happen is the RBCs and cells will be in down, and while the clear liquid fluid we call as a blood plasma. That's mostly a water content. So the oxygen carriage in the water is almost the same as blood plasma. So the primary function of our lung is to get the oxygen into our bloodstream and remove carbon dioxide from the blood. So the oxygen is for energy generation, eventually inside the mitochondria of the cells. And the carbon dioxide is waste product of metabolism in tissue. So let's consider about partial pressure concept of an oxygen. So partial pressure is a fraction of the pressure in a gas that is caused by molecules of oxygen. So first, concentration of oxygen in a liquid, let's consider about that. And that we can describe as a molar concentration, which means the moles of oxygen in a unit volume of liquid, such as water. So for that, we can consider a novel experiment. So let's consider about this chamber, which is about 2 liters. So 1 liter is oxygen-free liquid, such as water, and the other side of 1 liter is pure gas of oxygen. Then what happens when we expose this in this closed system, then over time, the oxygen molecule in the gas will diffuse into the liquid until it gets equilibrium, and such that at equilibrium, the gas will contain less oxygen, while the water or the liquid will contain oxygen. And this is at equilibrium, there's no more exchange. So that's the relationship with a partial pressure of oxygen in the gas will be uniquely related to the concentration of oxygen molecules in this liquid. So when we do this by varying the pressure of the oxygen gas, by changing it or over and over, we will be able to get this kind of graph, which is in this case, this can be considered as a linear relation, or we choose the linear relation, linear part of this graph, such that our partial pressure of oxygen inside the gas, while they vary, at equilibrium, we will have the oxygen concentration in terms of moles of oxygen per milliliter or cubic centimeter in this liquid. So this linear relationship can be described as concentration of oxygen in pure water can be uniquely determined by the partial pressure of the oxygen in this gas. And that proportionality constant can be empirically determined. So to make things in easier, we can have a partial pressure of oxygen as a concentration of oxygen in a liquid at standard temperature and pressure, which is defined as a 0 degrees C and 1 atmosphere, which is of course 1.013 times 10 to the 5 Pascal, or 1 atm. So this we call as a standard temperature and pressure, and the proportionality or constant can be determined by this way. So it turns out that this H is a number of moles per unit volume of the liquid divided by Pascal in this unit. So that defines oxygen solubility in pure water. And we will use this one for the next slide. So by using that property, we can consider oxygen carrying capacity of water and later on in blood. So why are we doing this? So we know that the water can also dissolve oxygen, and fishes and many aquatic lives depend on intake of oxygen this way. But we have a blood. Inside the blood, the red blood cells are there. Inside there, there's a hemoglobin. And we somehow know that hemoglobin carries the oxygen. And why have we evolved to use this? And that's the question. So for that, let's have some background knowledge. Concentration of gas can be defined in different ways. So one way is moles of that gas substance per unit volume of liquid. Or another way is because it's originally gas, we can convert it into volume at standard temperature and pressure. So that is equivalent volume of an ideal gas at standard temperature and pressure per unit volume of liquid. So that we already know that 1 mole of an ideal gas at standard temperature and pressure will be how much? That is 22.4 liters. So that's what we know already. So let's use this for calculating oxygen in moles or in volumes in water at standard temperature and pressure when the oxygen is when the water is exposed to consider pure oxygen gas, which is 100% oxygen. Then from the previous oxygen solubility equation, we can calculate it. So oxygen concentration in water as STP status is H times partial pressure. So H, we already have it from empirical formula. And pure oxygen gas has a partial pressure of just 1 atm, so which is this. And then we will get this 1.02 e to the minus 6 moles of oxygen per milliliter of water. Or we can convert it into an ideal gas volume, which is by using this, it's 2.28 e to the minus 2 milliliter of oxygen per milliliter of water. So that's one thing we've got. And now consider this problem into our lung case. So in lung case, so oxygen in moles or in volumes inside the blood plasma. Let's consider there's no RBC, only blood plasma, which is the same, almost the same as water, and across alveoli. Then the partial pressure now matters. So inside alveolus, the oxygen partial pressure is known to be 100 millimilli Hg. As you know, in the atmosphere, the oxygen takes about 21%, which is out of the 760 millimilli Hg of atmospheric pressure, it will become 160 millimilli Hg in dry air. However, inside alveolus, this is moisture-tried, it's almost saturated. So in that case, the oxygen partial pressure is known as 100 millimilli Hg. So assuming oxygen concentration in this alveolus, now blood plasma, which will form, come in contact and gas exchange will form an instantaneous equilibrium state. So assuming oxygen concentration in blood plasma will be in equilibrium with the alveolar oxygen after gas exchange, then we can compute the oxygen in moles in blood plasma, which will be this oxygen in pure oxygen gas times partial pressure of oxygen, which is not 760, but 100. So this fraction will give the oxygen concentration in blood plasma that is about, in terms of moles and in terms of volumes of ideal gas, it's a 3e to the minus 3 milliliter of oxygen per milliliter of plasma. So this number is important when we assume that there's no RBC or hemoglobin in our blood. It's almost like water containing this oxygen. Then we have to consider our body demands for amount of oxygen with our normal heart circulating capacity that we call as a cardiac output. So here comes the equilibrium curve for oxygen, both in blood and in water. And water here is the same as plasma. So this shows a little complicated, but x-axis is partial pressure of oxygen. As you can see, partial pressure goes higher and higher. The dissolved oxygen in water will be proportionally increased, while hemoglobin is an amazing unit that has a high oxygen carrying capacity. Look at this. This has this very interesting shape of dependent on hemoglobin saturation. It already reaches about partial pressure of oxygen when it comes to about 100 millimilli Hg. It's already almost close to 100, actually 97.5% of saturation reaches there. And that oxygen content will be close to 0.2 milliliter of oxygen per milliliter of blood, which is pretty high. So why blood is way better oxygen carrier than water? Due to the hemoglobin molecule, which can bind and carry one hemoglobin quaternary structure, can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. And blood concentration and partial pressure, you can see in water, it's almost linear, but in hemoglobin, it's not linear, but its shape is almost like an S shape. So it saturates earlier, you can see, and that we call as a sigmoidal curve. So when the hemoglobin binding sites are filled, the blood becomes quickly saturated with oxygen. So arterial blood, which is loaded with oxygen from alveolar gas at a partial pressure of 100 millimilli Hg, is already nearly saturated with oxygen. With this, let's calculate oxygen carrying capacity and compare of water, which is blood plasma only, and blood, which is RBC case. So first we need to know our body's resting demand from previously. About oxygen is about 250 milliliter of oxygen per unit minute. And we know normal cardiac output, which the heart will circulate about 5 liters per minute. So that's normal cardiac output. Then let's compare two things. Oxygen delivery by dissolved oxygen in just water or blood plasma if there were no RBCs. Comparison with oxygen delivery by the hemoglobin in the blood RBC is the concentration is 3 to the e to the minus third of milliliter of oxygen per milliliter of plasma multiplied by normal cardiac output, which is 5 liters of plasma per minute. And that comes to 15 milliliter of oxygen per minute if there's no hemoglobin and only our blood plasma or water is actually circulating, then you can see this is way less than our normal demand of resting demand of oxygen. So this is a big problem. We can't live with this. But luckily with the hemoglobin, you remember the previously, it's almost close to 0.2 cubic centimeter or milliliter of oxygen per milliliter of blood plasma. Then that multiplied by cardiac output gives 1,000 milliliter of oxygen per minute, which is way a few times higher than our normal need of resting demand for oxygen. So this describes our RBCs carry almost 70 times as much oxygen as water at a partial pressure of 100 millimilli Hg as inside alveolar gas. And so this proves that why do we need a hemoglobin, and that is already way higher than our providing the oxygen for our resting demand. So this is with this, I'm going to finish understanding concept of external and internal respiration, and we defined and the air volumes and flow rates in the lungs and ventilation rate. And we understand how oxygen is carried by blood and the quantitative relationship describing oxygen concentration in the blood and in the alveolar gas. And the rest of things, understanding diffusing capacity of the lung and how it relates to the property of the respiratory membrane will be covered later on when we are having transport phenomena lecture. Thank you for your attention.